in the thin, sharp air of the high Andes, where breath comes dear and the sun is a cruel god, a small green leaf was more than sustenance. For millennia, it was a sacrament. Its origins are lost in the deep time of South America, a whisper in the archaeological record dating back at least 8,000 years. Traces of its alkaloid have been found in the hair of mummies from the coast of Peru, bodies wrapped in fine textiles and buried with a small pouch, a chuspa, containing a carefully preserved cluster of the desiccated leaves. This was not a casual habit, but a ritual compact between humanity and the unforgiving landscape. The plant itself is unassuming, a shrub with bright green oval leaves and small white flowers that give way to red berries. It prefers the humid, steep slopes of the Yungas, the eastern foothills of the Andes, where ancient cultures learned to terrace the earth to build intricate walls of stone that climb towards the sky, creating stairways of cultivation for their sacred crop. For the Inca, the last and greatest of the Andean empires, this leaf was the nexus of their world. They called it Mama Coca, a feminine deity, and a gift from the sun god Inti to soothe the suffering of his children. But this gift was not given freely. The Inca state was a marvel of totalitarian logistics, and the leaf was a jealously guarded privilege reserved for the Sapa Inca himself, the royalty, and the high priests. When the priests sought to commune with the gods or divine the future, they would chew a quid of leaves to read the patterns cast upon a ceremonial cloth. When a laborer was conscripted for the mita, the mandatory public service that built the temples of Cusco and the fortresses of Machu Picchu, he was given a daily measure of leaves. It was fuel that suppressed the pangs of hunger, dulled the ache of exhaustion, and held at bay the crippling effects of altitude sickness. The empire's arteries were its roads, and its lifeblood was the chasqui, the imperial runner. These men were the Inca Internet, a relay system capable of carrying a message from Quito to Cusco, a distance of over 1,000 miles in under a week, thanks to the endurance provided by the leaf. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in 1532 initially saw this practice through the rigid lens of their own faith and declared it a tool of the devil. But this moral certitude soon collided with a much more powerful force, economics. The Spanish had come for silver, and deep within the earth at Potosi, at a hellish altitude of 13,000 feet, they found a mountain made of it. To tear the silver from the guts of that mountain, they forced indigenous men into the dark tunnels. The Spanish quickly realized what the Inca had known all along. The leaf allowed men to work beyond the limits of human endurance with less food. And so, the very priests who had called it the work of Satan began to own coca plantations. The leaf, once a divine privilege, became a tool of colonial subjugation, fueling the extraction that filled the coffers of the Spanish crown for 300 years. As the 19th century dawned, European science began to unlock the leaf's true power in the laboratory. In 1855, a German chemist named Friedrich Gaedke isolated a crude yellowish substance he called erythroxyline. The final breakthrough came 5 years later in 1860 in the university town of Göttingen. A graduate student named Albert Niemann, working under the famed chemist Friedrich Wöhler, refined the process using a meticulous series of chemical washes. He extracted a pure crystalline alkaloid, white, odorless, and bitter. Upon placing a few crystals on his tongue, he noted it went numb. He gave this new substance a proper scientific name, cocaine. The world did not immediately notice until Angelo Mariani, a shrewd Corsican entrepreneur in Paris, had an epiphany in 1863. He began importing tons of Peruvian coca leaves and steeping them in fine Bordeaux wine to create a potent elixir he called Vin Mariani. It was a sensation. Mariani solicited testimonials from everyone who was anyone. Popes Leo XIII and Pius X endorsed it, with Leo even awarding Mariani a Vatican gold medal. Queen Victoria drank it, Thomas Edison credited it with helping him stay awake, and Ulysses S. Grant sipped it while writing his memoirs. Writers from Émile Zola to Jules Verne penned glowing tributes. It was the perfect tonic for the frantic energy of the era. America soon followed suit. In Atlanta, Georgia, a pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton was wrestling with his own demons. A Confederate veteran addicted to morphine, he sought a cure and created Pemberton's French wine coca. But in 1886, Fulton County enacted prohibition, taking alcohol off the table. Undeterred, Pemberton reformulated his tonic, replacing the wine with sugary syrup and carbonated water, adding caffeine-rich cola nut, and keeping the coca leaf extract. He called his new creation Coca-Cola. Sold as a cure for headaches and exhaustion, each glass contained a significant dose of cocaine. While entrepreneurs were capitalizing on the high, the medical establishment was catching up, led by a young Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud. In 1884, Freud experimented on himself and was euphoric. In his paper Über Coca, he declared it a miracle drug and a cure for depression and morphine addiction. He gave it to his patients, friends, and his fiancée Martha. His work inspired a colleague, the ophthalmologist Carl Kahler, to investigate the numbing effect. In 1884, Kahler performed surgery on a human eye. Without pain, birthing local anesthesia. However, the fall from grace was swift. The miracle cure began to reveal a darker side as users descended into paranoia and hallucinations, including the sensation of insects crawling under the skin. No case was more damning than that of Freud's friend, Dr. Ernst von Fleischl-Marxau, who died a shattered man after descending into cocaine psychosis tormented by visions of white snakes. Freud ceased his advocacy, but the damage was done. In the United States, the panic took on a sinister racial dimension. By 1914, newspapers like the New York Times were printing articles by Dr. Edward H. Williams claiming that cocaine made black men immune to pistol bullets, a calculated myth that transformed the user from a victim into a predator in the public eye. The wheels of regulation began to turn. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 mandated accurate labeling, leading Coca-Cola to quietly switch to decocainized leaves around 1903. But it was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 that truly changed the landscape. Though framed as a tax law, it was enforced as a prohibition. Doctors were arrested for prescribing to addicts, and the drug vanished from pharmacies, only to reappear in the back alley. The era of the medical miracle was over. The era of the black market had begun. Driven underground, cocaine became the secret handshake of the new elite during the Jazz Age. In the roaring 20s, nose candy was the perfect accessory for the speakeasies of New York and Chicago. Criminal figures like Arnold Rothstein, who fixed the 1919 World Series, understood the economics of this low-volume, high-margin luxury good. In Hollywood, it fueled the silent film industry until the death of heartthrob Wallace Reed in 1923 exposed the rot beneath the glamour. While the North partied, the story was beginning in earnest far to the south. In the mid-20th century, the first true pioneers of the international trade emerged. For a time, the hub was Chile. In the 1960s, figures like the Godmother built sophisticated networks. They developed the process of turning leaves into pasta base in the jungles, then flying it to labs to be refined into pure cocaine hydrochloride. But history intervened in 1973 when a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile. Pinochet's regime cracked down on the traffickers, severing the Chilean connection. The trade, needing a new home with a history of smuggling and weak government, shifted north to Colombia, setting the stage for an explosion of violence and wealth that the world had never seen. The studios demanded inhuman hours, relentless energy, and a constant dazzling performance both on and off the screen. In this crucible of fame, the little white powder found a very welcome home. They called it Girl or Nose Candy, a whimsical nickname for a demanding chemical mistress. It was the pick-me-up before a long night of shooting under hot Klieg lights, the social lubricant at a debauched weekend party in a Laurel Canyon mansion, and the silent partner in many a star's meteoric rise and tragic fall. The death of heartthrob Wallace Reed in 1923, officially from morphine addiction acquired after an onset injury, ripped the curtain back just enough for the public to glimpse the rot beneath the glamour. It was a scandal that terrified the studio heads, not because of the human cost, but because of the threat to the box office. The industry scrambled to police itself with the Hays Code, a new set of moral guidelines, but all it really did was force the secrets deeper underground, making them even more tantalizing for those who could afford them. The powder wasn't just for the hedonists, it also found a place among the thinkers, the writers, and the artists. In the bohemian enclaves of Greenwich Village and the smoky cafes of post-war Paris, cocaine was presented not as a party favor, but as a key to unlock perception, to shatter the mundane, and to fuel the engine of creativity through the lonely early hours of the morning. For the surrealist painter, it might offer a fleeting, jagged vision, and for the novelist wrestling with the great American novel, it was a way to keep the words flowing, to push past the wall of exhaustion and doubt. It was seen as a tool, a cerebral stimulant that could sharpen the mind and peel back the layers of reality. This, of course, was a beautiful and dangerous illusion. The creativity it seemed to inspire was often just frantic, scattered energy, the profound insights merely the circular, self-referential ramblings of a brain chemistry gone haywire. But the myth was powerful, wrapping the drug in a cloak of intellectual seriousness and making it a sacrament for the avant-garde. And who supplied this clandestine world, connecting the Hollywood starlet with the Parisian poet? The criminal underworld. Naturally, the same shrewd, unsentimental businessmen who ran the bootlegging empire saw a perfect opportunity for product diversification. Figures like Arnold Rothstein, the New York kingpin who allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series, understood the simple economics of vice. Cocaine was a luxury good. It was low volume, high margin, and portable. It didn't require fleets of trucks or cavernous warehouses like illegal liquor, just a few well-placed smugglers and a network of discreet dealers to service the wealthiest, most influential corners of society. The supply lines were still rudimentary, often relying on legitimate pharmaceutical supplies diverted from Europe or small opportunistic shipments from South America. But the foundation was being laid, and the demand was established. Cocaine had found its new identity, a forbidden luxury, a powder that separated the daring, the decadent, and the damned from the ordinary world. It was a promise of energy, of brilliance, of belonging. A very expensive promise, paid for in cash at first, and then inevitably in other currencies. While the bright young things of the North were discovering the illicit thrill of the powder, its story was beginning in earnest far to the south under the high, thin sun of the Andes. For centuries, the indigenous people of Peru and Bolivia had a relationship with the coca leaf that was anything but decadent. It was a matter of survival. They chewed the leaves, often mixed with a bit of ash or lime to help release the alkaloids, for energy to work at punishing altitudes, to stave off hunger, and for ritual and medicinal purposes. The coca leaf was a gift from the gods, a sacred plant woven into the very fabric of their culture, a mild stimulant as common and essential as the potato. The transformation of this sacred leaf into a global commodity is a story of chemistry, ambition, and geography. It begins not with cartels, but with quiet entrepreneurial chemists and smugglers who saw an opportunity to connect the ancient agricultural bounty of the Andes with the growing nervous appetite of the world. In the middle of the 20th century, the first true pioneers of the international cocaine trade began to emerge. They were not at first the flamboyant narcos of later legend, but sharp, calculating businessmen operating in the shadows. For a time, the hub of this nascent industry was not Colombia, but the long coastal nation of Chile. In cities like Valparaiso and Santiago, smugglers who had cut their teeth in other rackets saw the potential. One of the key figures was a Chilean woman known as the Godmother, a restaurateur who used her business as a front to build one of the first major trafficking networks in the 1960s. Her organization was sophisticated for its time. They didn't just move the product, they controlled the production. The process they developed became the blueprint for the entire industry. It was a grim alchemy, turning a green leaf into a white powder. First, the coca leaves harvested by poor farmers in the remote valleys of Peru and Bolivia were taken to crude hidden pits in the jungle where they were soaked in gasoline or kerosene and mashed into a pulp, often by men stomping on them with their bare feet. This slurry was then mixed with acid and other chemicals to extract the raw cocaine alkaloids, creating a gritty off-white substance known as pasta base or coca paste. This paste was the crucial intermediate product, far more compact and potent than the raw leaves, making it easier to smuggle across borders. The coca paste would be flown in small rickety planes from the jungles of Bolivia and Peru into the deserts of northern Chile. There, in clandestine laboratories often little more than shacks or hidden basements, the final delicate stage of refinement would take place. Chemists, some of whom were professionally trained, would use a volatile cocktail of chemicals like ether and acetone to purify the coca paste, washing away the impurities until only the pure glittering crystals of cocaine hydrochloride remained. It was a dangerous, foul-smelling process, where one mistake or stray spark could send the entire lab up in a ball of fire. But the profits were astronomical. A kilo of coca paste bought for a few $100s in the Bolivian jungle could be transformed into a kilogram of pure cocaine worth thousands of dollars in Santiago and tens of thousands in the United States or Europe. The early Chilean traffickers established the routes, flying the finished product to staging points in Central America and the Caribbean, or using mules, human couriers, to carry small amounts on commercial flights. They were building the very first iteration of a multinational supply chain based on a single powerful product. Then history intervened. In 1973, a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the socialist government of Salvador Allende in Chile. In the brutal crackdown that followed, Pinochet's new regime had little tolerance for independent criminal enterprises. Many of the established traffickers were arrested, executed, or forced to flee, severing the Chilean connection. But the demand for cocaine in the United States and Europe hadn't gone anywhere. In fact, it was growing exponentially. A vacuum had been created, and nature, especially the nature of black markets, abhors a vacuum. The business of refining coca paste and exporting the finished product needed a new home, and it found one just up the coast in a country with a long history of smuggling, a weak central government, and a class of ambitious, utterly ruthless young men who were hungry for wealth and power. That country was Colombia. The entire center of gravity of the cocaine trade shifted north, and in doing so it set the stage for an explosion of violence and wealth that the world had never seen. The quiet, business-like smuggling of the Chilean era was about to be replaced by something far more monstrous. The machine was about to be built. The men who built this machine were not from the traditional Colombian elite, but from the rough, striving middle classes of cities like Medellín. They were men who had grown up with a chip on their shoulder, watching the old money families run the country from their exclusive clubs and haciendas. They saw cocaine not as a social vice, but as a historic opportunity, a vehicle for their own violent form of upward mobility. And at the center of this new class of narco-entrepreneurs was one man whose name would become synonymous with the drug itself, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Escobar was not a genius chemist or a master logistician, not at first. His genius lay in his vision and his terrifying lack of restraint. He began his career in the grimy underworld of Medellín, stealing cars, smuggling cigarettes, and running kidnapping for ransom schemes. He was pragmatic, brutal, and possessed an innate understanding of the two levers that move the world, fear and desire. When the cocaine trade began to migrate from Chile, Escobar didn't just see a chance to participate, he saw a chance to dominate. He understood that the real money wasn't in just moving a few kilos, but in controlling the entire chain of production from the leaf to the street, creating an industrial process. He and his associates formed what became known as the Medellín Cartel, less a rigid hierarchical organization and more a loose, powerful consortium of traffickers who cooperated to maximize profits and protect their business. There were the Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio Jr., who came from a family of horse breeders and brought a touch of old-world business sense to the enterprise. There was Carlos Lader, a brilliant, eccentric, and volatile German Colombian who idolized both John Lennon and Adolf Hitler. Later's great contribution was logistical. He bought a small island in the Bahamas called Norman's Cay and transformed it into the ultimate smuggling depot, building a runway, a radar system, and refrigerated warehouses. From this private fiefdom, just a short flight from the Florida coast, the cartel could fly planeload after planeload of cocaine directly into the insatiable American market. What Escobar and his partners did was apply the principles of industrial capitalism to a criminal enterprise by vertically integrating. They financed coca cultivation in Peru and Bolivia, ensuring a steady supply of raw material, and built vast, sprawling laboratory complexes deep in the Colombian jungle known as superlabs. These weren't sheds. They were small cities with airplane hangars, dormitories for hundreds of workers, kitchens, power generators, and sophisticated chemical processing equipment. At complexes like Tranquilandia, they could produce 10 to 20 tons of pure cocaine every single week. The scale was almost impossible to comprehend. They were no longer smugglers, but manufacturers producing a product for a global market on an assembly line of breathtaking efficiency. The logistics of moving the product were equally audacious, utilizing fleets of small aircraft carrying several hundred kilograms from Colombia to Norman's Cay, or dropping waterproofed cargo into the ocean to be picked up by speedboats. They even invested in submarines, crude diesel-powered vessels that could carry a ton or two of cocaine while submerged, making them nearly invisible to law enforcement. And then there was the money. The profits were so vast they became a logistical problem in their own right. Billions of dollars in cash, mostly small bills from street sales in the United States, had to be brought back to Colombia. It was stuffed into suitcases, packed into the landing gear of private jets, and hidden inside television sets and refrigerators. The cartel was spending thousands of dollars a month just on rubber bands to bundle the stacks of cash. Pablo Escobar at his peak was estimated to be one of the richest men in the world, with a personal fortune in the tens of billions, wealthier than many nations. With this incredible wealth came incredible power, and Escobar intended to use it to bend the entire nation of Colombia to his will. His business strategy was simple and chillingly articulated. Plata o plomo, silver or lead, for any policeman, judge, politician, or journalist who stood in his way. There was a choice: accept the bribe, the silver, and look the other way, or refuse and receive the lead, a bullet. It was a campaign of corruption and terror waged on an industrial scale. The cartel systematically infiltrated every level of the Colombian state, keeping judges, police commanders, and politicians on their payroll. Escobar himself, in a move of breathtaking arrogance, had himself elected as an alternate to the Colombian Congress in 1982, seeking the legitimacy and legal immunity that came with the office. But when charisma and cash were not enough, the cartel unleashed the lead with a ferocity that plunged Colombia into a state of civil war. The Minister of Justice Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, who dared to denounce Escobar, was gunned down in Bogotá in 1984. Luis Carlos Galán, a charismatic presidential candidate who made the fight against the cartels the centerpiece of his campaign, was assassinated at a public rally in 1989. They placed a bomb on Avianca Flight 203 in an attempt to kill another presidential candidate, Cesar Gaviria, who was not on board, murdering all 107 people on the plane. They detonated a massive truck bomb outside the headquarters of the DA's Colombia's security agency, killing 70 people and wounding hundreds. This was not crime, this was narco-terrorism, the actions of a parallel state waging war against a sovereign nation. The Medellín Cartel had taken the simple coca leaf and transformed it into a weapon of mass destabilization, building an empire of corruption, addiction, and fear, funded by an endless river of white powder. While the world's cameras were transfixed by the volcanic violence of Medellín, a very different kind of organization was quietly consolidating, its power a few hundred kilometers to the south, in the sun-drenched city of Cali. If Pablo Escobar was a narco-warlord, his rivals in Cali were the board of directors of a multinational corporation whose primary product happened to be cocaine. They called themselves Los Caballeros de Cali, the gentlemen of Cali, and cultivated this image with meticulous care. Theirs was not the path of the car bomb, but the path of the quiet bribe and the compromised judge. They understood that true power is not the ability to blow up a building, but the ability to ensure no one is ever prosecuted for it. The cartel was a syndicate of 4 key figures: the brothers Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, Helmer Pacho Herrera, and Jose Chepe Santa Cruz Londono. Gilberto, known as the chess player, was the strategist and public face, while Miguel managed the day-to-day logistics. Pacho Herrera oversaw distribution and logistics, and Chepe Santa Cruz was the ambassador who built the foundation of their American operation in New York City. The Cali model was built on information and infiltration. They invested heavily in technology and human intelligence, systematically bribing employees of the Colombian phone company to tap nearly every call in and out of Cali. Their spies were everywhere, creating a blanket of silence and complicity that made them seem untouchable. Their logistical innovations were just as sophisticated. Rather than suitcases, they dissolved cocaine in chemicals and mixed it with legitimate shipments. It was hidden inside hollowed-out lumber, mixed into coffee beans, or secreted within concrete fence posts. One of their most ingenious methods involved shipping thousands of boxes of frozen broccoli to Miami, where legitimate produce concealed wax-coated facsimiles made of pure cocaine. They professionalized money laundering to an art form, using a complex web of shell corporations and offshore banks. At their zenith in the early 1990s after Escobar's death, the Cali cartel was estimated by the DEA to be responsible for 80% of the world's cocaine supply. They were a quiet, efficient, vertically integrated monopoly, a shadow government whose influence stretched from the coca fields of the Andes to the highest corridors of power in Bogotá, and whose product was being delivered with corporate precision to a market that was clamoring for it. This meticulously packaged, industrially shipped, and expertly laundered powder was flowing north in a vast white river to a nation that was ready to receive it with open arms and open wallets. America in the late 1970s and 1980s was a country in the midst of a profound cultural shift, where the hangover of Vietnam and the cynicism of Watergate were giving way to a new, unapologetic era of ambition, consumerism, and self-gratification. It was the age of Reagan, of Wall Street titans and Hollywood blockbusters, an era that worshipped speed, success, and status, and cocaine became its perfect fuel. Unlike the marijuana and LSD of the 1960s counterculture, cocaine was the drug of the aspirational, promising to make users wittier, energetic, and powerful. It was the ultimate accessory for the young urban professional, a line of pure white confidence snorted in a bathroom stall before a major presentation, or a dab on the gums before a high-stakes negotiation. On the frantic trading floors of Wall Street, it was the engine that allowed brokers to endure 20-hour days, while in the exclusive backrooms of Hollywood studios, multi-million-dollar deals were sealed over glass tabletops dusted with white powder. The drug shed its back-alley stigma and stepped into the Klieg lights, a transformation most apparent at Studio 54, where the club's famous logo, a man in the moon with a silver spoon to his nose, was a brazen acknowledgement of the social lubricant that fueled the glittering machine. The paraphernalia itself became a status symbol, with gold razor blades and polished mirrors fetishizing the rituals of consumption. Popular culture reflected this glamour through films like Scarface and songs referencing the White Horse, creating a feedback loop where insatiable American demand fueled the sophistication of the Colombian cartels. The gentlemen of Cali watched this explosion not with the wild eyes of street dealers, but with the cool calculation of market analysts, ramping up production to meet the needs of their most profitable customer. However, the laws of the market are relentless, and someone was bound to find a way to make the champagne of drugs affordable for everyone, unleashing a storm that would tear through the very fabric of American society. The chemistry was brutally simple, requiring no sophisticated lab, just a kitchen pot, baking soda, water, and heat to free the cocaine from its hydrochloride salt. As the mixture cooled, it hardened into small crystalline rocks that made a crackling sound when heated, giving the new substance its name, crack. This transformation changed the route of administration, as inhaling the vaporized cocaine delivered the drug to the brain through the large surface area of the lungs in seconds, creating a euphoric rush exponentially more intense than snorting. This intense euphoria lasted only 5 to 10 minutes, followed by a crushing crash that created an addiction of unprecedented speed and ferocity. Economically, crack shattered the barrier to entry. While a gram of powder might sell for $100, that same gram could be cooked into numerous rocks sold for as little as $2 to $5. This democratized the drug, opening a vast market in America's inner cities, communities already hollowed out by deindustrialization and neglect. The arrival of cheap, smokable cocaine transformed street corners into open-air drug markets and birthed a new generation of heavily armed street gangs fighting brutal turf wars. The crack house became a symbol of urban decay, and families were torn apart as addiction took hold, leading to a media frenzy over crack babies born into chaos and poverty. The government's response was not one of public health, but of war, fueled by a racialized media narrative that painted the user not as a glamorous broker, but as a menacing young black man. This panic culminated in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which enshrined a staggering disparity in sentencing. Possessing just 5 grams of crack cocaine triggered the same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence as possessing 500 grams of powder cocaine. This 100-to-1 sentencing ratio had catastrophic consequences, as the typical user of powder cocaine was more likely to be white and middle class, while the user of crack was far more likely to be poor and African American, leading to the mass incarceration of a generation of young black men. The war on drugs became a literal war, with police departments militarized with surplus hardware like armored personnel carriers and M16 rifles, conducting no-knock raids that turned living rooms into battlefields. Simultaneously, the U.S. launched a foreign policy of eradication in the Andes, spraying glyphosate herbicide that destroyed legal crops alongside coca, driving farmers deeper into poverty in the arms of traffickers. The weapon of extradition, the threat of an American jail cell, terrified cartel leaders like Pablo Escobar, who waged a terroristic war against the Colombian state to avoid it. While the dismantling of the Medellín and Cali cartels was celebrated as a victory in Washington, it merely cleared the way for a more formidable monster. The Colombian cartels had relied on Mexican smuggling families to move product across the 954-mile U.S.-Mexico border, paying them in cash. However, as the Colombians weak, Ned, a Mexican visionary named Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the Godfather, unified the smugglers into the Guadalajara cartel and changed the terms of the deal. Instead of cash fees, the Mexicans began demanding payment in product, eventually taking a 50% cut of every shipment. This transformed them from delivery boys into wholesalers with their own inventory and direct access to the American market. When the Guadalajara cartel fractured following the murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena, it split into powerful regional entities: the Tijuana cartel in the northwest, the Juarez cartel in the center, and the Sinaloa cartel in the mountains. The Mexicans now controlled the logistics, prices, and profits, reducing the Colombians to mere suppliers. This shift directed a river of money, tens of billions of dollars a year, back into Mexico, allowing the cartels to evolve into a parallel narco state. Through the policy of plata o plomo, silver or lead, they co-opted police, military, and politicians, while also providing social services like road paving and dispute resolution in rural areas, effectively becoming the government. The cartels armed themselves like armies, establishing training camps and employing former Special Forces soldiers. The Los Zetas organization, formed by deserters from the Mexican Army's elite airborne group, introduced military tactics, encrypted communications, and heavy weaponry like caliber sniper rifles and monster armored trucks to the conflict. The extent of this power was terrifiedly demonstrated in October 2019 in Culiacan, when the Mexican military captured Ovidio Guzman, a son of El Chapo. The Sinaloa cartel responded by laying siege to the city, outmaneuvering state forces until the president of Mexico ordered Guzman's release to prevent further bloodshed. This proved that in certain regions, the state's monopoly on violence had vanished. As the American market saturated, the traffickers looked east to Europe, a new frontier with wealthy cities and open wallets. The Colombians partnered with the Ndrangheta, the Calabrian Mafia, who controlled the massive container port of Gioia Tauro. This partnership was a model of criminal efficiency, utilizing maritime logistics to move tons of cocaine hidden in legitimate cargo. When European authorities tightened security, the traffickers adapted by using West Africa as a transit hub. The coastline from Senegal to Nigeria became a smuggler's paradise where mother ships offloaded product to smaller boats that darted to shore in unstable nations like Guinea-Bissau, turning them into the first true narco states outside Latin America. The White River had become a global ocean, and the story of the powder was far from over. It could be stored in warehouses in Bissau or Conakry, guarded by bribed officials or private militias. The region already had sophisticated, long-established smuggling networks, honed by decades of moving everything from diamonds to cigarettes to people. Cocaine was just another commodity. From West Africa, the routes into Europe were numerous. The product could be repackaged and flown on commercial flights by armies of couriers, hidden in cargo planes carrying fish or fruit to Paris and Brussels, or most audaciously, flown directly into the heart of Europe on private jets, ghost flights that filed false flight plans and landed at small, poorly monitored airfields in Spain or Portugal. The sheer ingenuity was something to behold. They used semi-submersible vessels, low-profile drone submarines that could carry several tons of cocaine, gliding silently beneath the waves, almost impossible to detect by radar or sonar. The European corridor was no longer a single path. It was a complex multi-layered web, a circulatory system pumping a white POI. Sun into the continent's bloodstream. The Ndrangheta were not the only players for long. The vacuum of the collapsed Soviet Union and the chaos of the Yugoslav wars had forged a new generation of ruthlessly efficient criminal organizations. Balkan syndicates, particularly Serbian and Albanian groups, established themselves as major players. They were disciplined, multilingual, and extremely violent, specializing in overland logistics, moving cocaine from southern ports of entry northward in trucks through the seamless, borderless expanse of the Schengen zone. They controlled street-level distribution in cities across Germany, Scandinavia, and the United Kingdom. In the port cities of Antwerp and Rotterdam, the logistical hearts of Europe, the so-called Mokro Mafia, composed largely of Dutch-Moroccan criminals, battled for control of the docks, their feuds playing out in a string of shocking public assassinations. Europe's old world calm was shattered. The continent had its own cocaine war now, less visible than Colombia's perhaps, but just as corrosive, turning port cities into battlegrounds and quiet villages in Africa into hubs of global crime. The powder, ever adaptable, had found its new home. As the 21st century wore on, the nature of the powder itself began to change. The story takes another dark turn, not in the jungles of the Andes or the boardrooms of the cartels, but in clandestine laboratories far away, and in the very chemistry of the drugs themselves. A new specter had emerged, a synthetic ghost that would attach itself to the cocaine trade with devastating consequences. Its name was fentanyl. It began subtly as a whisper in coroner's reports and toxicology screens in the mid-2010s, a cocaine overdose, but with anomalous findings. The victim hadn't just stopped breathing from cardiac arrest, the classic cocaine-induced outcome. They had simply faded out DUE to respiratory depression, the telltale sign of an opioid. At first, it was thought to be a case of the user mixing drugs, a speedball of cocaine and heroin. But then the cases multiplied, and the victims were often people with no history of opioid use, weekend warriors and partygoers who thought they were buying a gram of cocaine for a night out. They had no idea they were ingesting one of the most potent opioids ever synthesized by man. Fentanyl is a creature of the laboratory, a pure synthetic first created in 1959 as a powerful anesthetic for surgery. It is 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. A dose the size of 2 grains of salt can be lethal to a person with no opioid tolerance. For the modern drug syndicate, particularly the Mexican cartels who had now largely eclipsed the Colombians as the dominant force in the North American market, fentanyl was a business miracle. Its precursor chemicals could be sourced cheaply from China, and it could be manufactured in a simple lab with no need for vast agricultural plantations, no coca farmers to manage, and no seasonal harvests. Its potency was its greatest economic advantage. A single kilogram of pure fentanyl, costing a few thousand to produce, could be cut and stretched to create hundreds of thousands of individual doses for the street. The contamination of the cocaine supply was born of this cold market logic. Sometimes it was accidental, a dealer using the same scale or mixing surface for both fentanyl-laced heroin and cocaine, where a tiny, invisible residue was all it took. But increasingly, it became deliberate, cutting cocaine with a cheap, powerful, and intensely addictive synthetic opioid was a monstrously effective business strategy. It stretched the expensive cocaine, increasing profit margins, and for those who survived, it could create a new powerful dependency. Hooking a user on opioids without them even knowing it. The euphoric rush of cocaine would be followed by the heavy narcotic pull of fentanyl, a confusing and often terrifying combination that rewired the user's brain chemistry. The public health consequences were catastrophic because the cocaine user base is fundamentally different from the heroin user base. They have no concept of opioid overdose, no Narcan on hand, and no understanding of respiratory arrest. The party drug had become a game of Russian roulette. The third wave of the opioid crisis had officially begun. Overdose deaths in the United States skyrocketed into unheard-of territory, with over 100,000 Americans dying a year, a significant and growing percentage involving cocaine contaminated with fentanyl. This new reality changed everything, turning every street-level dealer into a potential angel of death. The cartels in Mexico, primarily the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, CJNG, were now the primary manufacturers of this poison, pressing it into counterfeit prescription pills and mixing it into heroin, methamphetamine, and cocaine. They flooded the United States with it using the same sophisticated smuggling corridors they had perfected over decades. The powder that had once been seen as a symbol of glamour and success was now inextricably linked to a synthetic killer. The white powder was no longer just a drug. It was a potential poison delivery system, a Trojan horse carrying the deadliest synthetic opioid in history. And so we arrive at the end of our long, dark road, left to survey the wreckage of a century of ambition, greed, violence, and despair. The legacy of cocaine is etched onto the surface of the earth, carved into the fabric of societies, and buried in millions of graves. First, look to the land. The Amazon basin, the lungs of our planet, bears deep and permanent scars. For every hectare of land used to cultivate coca, several more are destroyed, beginning with slash-and-burn agriculture where ancient forests are cleared with fire and machete. The process of turning coca leaves into cocaine paste is a form of chemical warfare on the environment. In crude, hidden labs, rivers of gasoline or kerosene are used to strip the alkaloid from the leaf, and vats of sulfuric acid, caustic soda, and potassium permanganate are employed in the refinement. When finished, these poisons are dumped directly onto the forest floor or into the nearest stream, carrying them into the great river systems of the Amazon and the Orinoco, creating vast dead zones in what was once the most biodiverse ecosystem on Earth. Then there is the legacy of corruption, the hollowing out of nations. Cocaine money is a universal acid that dissolves institutions. In countries like Colombia in the 1980s and Mexico in the 2000s, the cartels achieved a level of power that rivaled the state, offering the choice of plata o plomo, silver or lead. Many chose the silver, and entire government departments became subsidiaries of the narco enterprise. Those who chose lead paid with their lives. This creates a vicious cycle where the state cannot provide security, leading people to turn to the local narco boss who dispenses brutal order. A narco state is born, a phenomenon we have seen shadow over West Africa, where drug money has funded coups. The powder creates a world of ghosts, ghost politicians, ghost police, and ghost economies. Finally, there is the human cost, a pyramid of suffering. At the bottom is the cocalero, the coca farmer, usually a poor peasant trapped by economics. Above him are the chemists breathing toxic fumes, and the mules, desperate young men and women who swallow condoms filled with cocaine, facing a gruesome death if a package bursts. There are the sicarios, teenage hitmen for whom murder is a job, and the victims of the endless wars between cartels marked by torture and public butchery. The cost is counted in the hundreds of thousands dead in Mexico, the generations in Colombia who knew nothing but conflict, and the communities in inner-city America decimated by the crack epidemic. And at the very top of the pyramid is the user. In a way, they are victims caught in addiction, but they are also the engine. Their demand is the signal that sets the infernal machine in motion, and their money is the fuel. Cocaine's ultimate trick was to disguise this global pyramid of misery as a line of white powder on a mirror. It promised power and glamour, but its true legacy is one of scarred landscapes, broken nations, and a body count that will never be fully known. A legacy of blood and powder endlessly renewed as long as the world keeps wanting.